camera if you want the RDP in it.
I know. Okay. Let's see. All right. It seems as though we might be live. Let me check on Facebook really quick.
No worries.
All right. We're live. I'd like to welcome everyone back to this week's show. We're calling this one Let's Talk Boost. We have the Boost man himself on the show again. We took a week off last week. Let's see. You were graduations. I was trying to drive back from California, and it just didn't work out. So we're
Didn't
doing.
work out, yeah, kid stuff. It's all good.
So last show, I'll do a quick little recap of last show while we're getting this shared out. We last show we talked about kind of the biggest differences between turbos and blowers. We kind of touched on compounds and we got cut off. Alexi was talking a little about his compound setup. What else did we talk about?
We just talked about like a little bit about wastegates and different sizes and configurations, and we figured we would go into it a little bit more. A lot of people don't understand the difference between like a draw through, blow through, or sizing a supercharger. There was a few questions on that, and we just kind of went over the basics. But I encourage any of you watching tonight to definitely watch the first one to get a little more information and segue into this one, and it might be good for you.
Yeah, and I don't think that necessarily you have to watch the first one, but if you want to kind of understand tonight what we're talking about and kind of what we're picking up on, there was some stuff that we're going to talk further tonight and kind of go back to the questions. So, but I think there was we kept it kind of short and sweet for the last one, and it had a lot of good response, a lot of good questions that we'll answer tonight. Let me finish sharing this into the pages, and then I think we'll roll with it. So, um, so Evan Hobgood, and I think Alexi kind of knows who Evan is. I've had Evan
Yeah,
on the show. Evan always comes out with good questions for these, and
yes, he does.
I kind of wanted to start on his question that he put out right in the beginning last time, and I know Evan and some friends are working on some offshore boats and some configurations there. And he says, offshore with an offshore race crew switching to turbos, will the crew have to completely relearn how to drive the boat?
For sure, 100%. The torque dynamics and the curves and how the power comes in and out is so critical on a turbocharged motor versus a supercharged motor. So it's really important to make sure that you always test a new product either way. But when you have a supercharged engine, the power is pretty, linear. It's always kind of there. With a turbocharged engine, just like we maybe mentioned before, it's kind of like a two-stroke motorcycle. They come in really hard. So, like especially in an offshore boat, when you're throttling on and off, depending on the RPM range that you're at in a race or in a turn or in any part of a straightaway, that will determine how hard that torque comes in. And you can get yourself in big trouble if you decelerate, enter a turn, and the boat starts maybe hooking just a little bit. You have a little lag and you throttle it, and all of a sudden the torque comes in. You better be ready for what that boat's going to do, because it's going to definitely act different than the supercharged engine that's more linear and smooth throughout the differential of power applying to the propellers in the boat. So yes, it's a huge learning curve. Um, I got to say that's a good question, because a lot of people don't realize. Like we had this issue when we were racing APVA years ago. I think it was like, I don't know, 99 or whatever. They had taken the supercharger rules away because the boats were going too fast. So then they made them naturally aspirated, but allowed us to go 12 and a half to 1 compression. That was a huge, huge learning curve. For me, I was a youngster, but still I had a lot of experience in a boat. And I can tell you that going into a turn and pulling back on the throttles a little bit gives you some leeway to be able to do some aggressive things in a turn with an offshore boat, knowing that you could get out of it with some torque, right? But when you're normally aspirated, you're coming into the turn wide open, flat out, and whatever the boat does, it does. So they thought they were making the rules safer. In my opinion, it was worse. It was more dangerous, you couldn't unhook a boat if it started to hook with torque. So we had to relearn everything. So hopefully that answers your question in several different ways. We went from supercharged to normally aspirated the opposite way. Then can you imagine going from learning normally aspirated to twin turbo? It would be like the direct swing the other way. So the short answer is yes, it's a huge learning curve.
And I compare a lot of things on this show to, driving off road, driving in the dunes, and
Sure.
a lot of people don't understand the how much easier it is when you have a car that's actually, a lot of people are getting out in the dunes with these side by sides. Well, the problem with these side
Right.
by sides is a lot of them are extremely underpowered for being out there. Where with
Right.
a V8 sand car, like the car that we have, if I get into something and I start, swaying one way or swaying the other way or start digging one way or other, I know that I can throttle out of there most of the time. And
Right.
it's kind of that same comparison. You have this
Well, yeah.
little
I mean,
tiny baby motor
right.
versus this one that creates a lot of torque. So
Right, and the sand car, we were talking about this today. We had an off-road customer here today picking up some fittings, and we were talking about his Subaru. He has a turbocharged Subaru in his rail, and he previously had a rotary. And I said, "How do you like the difference between the two?" And he goes, "It's like crazy." He says, "In the Subaru with the low RPM turbo, he can climb up a hill." And I was telling him, I said, "With the Subaru, you got to rev it to 16,000 RPM, and if you don't know or can't quite get it downshifted, you're never making it up the hill. It's like running a YZ 250 versus a CRF 450 four-stroke or something, of that, type of difference in
yeah,
power." So the torque it's all a learning curve, right?
yeah. So that kind of leads into the next question, which I kind of placed these on my list in this order on purpose.
Sure.
And the question was, and I'm kind of rewording this question a little bit, is what is the best application, race boats versus pleasure boats? If we're going with a non-naturally aspirated setup.
So I'm a little bit. Give me a little more info on that. So like you're talking about just a regular boat.
So I guess it's a two-part question. So in a race boat, what do you think is a better application, a turbocharger or a blower supercharger?
So um, I think for all around conditions, a supercharger type application would be an easier driver's boat because the power is more linear, right? But interestingly enough, it also depends on the speeds that you're entering your turns in, which turns into what's the course. So, like if you have long straightaways and you can afford to slow down and keep the turbos spooling, to where it's not so abrupt when you power back into it, uh, you know, that's kind of like a preference. I mean, if some of the race motors Mercury has in some of the boats, they're turbocharged, but they're calibrated a certain way too. So when you have the advantage of EFI and electronics to manipulate how hard the throttles come in and the torque, now you're talking about a whole different thing again, right? So, like in a sand car, we programmed an electronic throttle. So if the guy stabs the throttle, it doesn't listen to him. It only opens at a certain rate, no matter how hard he pushes the throttle, so he can drive this vehicle.
Yeah.
So that can be manipulated in any type of engine if you can get into the computer and get to the drive-by-wire settings and the rate of acceleration and throttle position sensing and all the things that are available in each application. So, my personal preference is supercharged because in these race boats, they're regulated power, right? So they say, look, these are the rules, you have to follow them. Or if it's normally aspirated, these are the rules and you have to follow them. So I think for safety and all around, in my personal opinion, I would like supercharged engines that may be limited to some sort of cubic inch, and that's probably about it. That way you can get yourself out of trouble. So
So I
that's
mean,
just my personal preference.
yeah, and I think it kind of transfers over to. I'm going to assume that for a pleasure boat, same application. A supercharger is going to be for something you might want to go, 70, 75 across Havasu, or you might want to pull your kids on a tube. You're going to want something like a supercharger where you've got that grunt. You don't have to sit there and wait for the power, and then put you back in your seat. So
Yeah, and that's hard on parts too. A lot of people don't realize it. Like if you sit there at the Naked Turtle in Lake Havasu and just watch some of the turbocharged boats leave, you'll notice they ramp way up and they'll hit the rev limiter. You'll hear them pop and do all kinds of weird things and think something's wrong, but it's normal every time they plane the boat. The computer is telling that engine, blow off all the boost, retard the timing, keep it at 6,300 RPM or whatever engine it is until the thing's on plane, and then bring the power back in. Well, no matter what, when that power comes in, that's a surge of torque. And when you have a surge of torque, you break gears, drives, twist shafts, shatter drive plates, bend ears on propellers, whatever you can imagine. It's the surge of power that you're trying to avoid to keep things sturdy and longevity. But in a race application, you want to have all that power come in. So it's a happy medium, right? So that's why I like the linear power of a supercharged engine, which pushes me into the whole thing, why I did the compound. I have both. I don't have any kind of any of that. My engine's linear all the way across. It just happens to have a vacuum cleaner pulling all the exhaust out. You know what I mean? So if you think of it in basic terms. So, but that's not for everybody.
So this is a good question, and I think this is the guy who actually also Justin Pharma. I can't say your last name, Justin. He said, "I'm assuming turbos are better for drive longevity due to the lack of instant torque."
It's not true actually, because what happens is when you don't have the instant torque, it's all fun and games, right? But when that torque comes in, it comes in abruptly.
Yeah.
So it's still surging the torque against the two gears. It's still giving. It's just giving it at a different RPM range. So, if you do studies on how the torque comes in, I can tell you without studying and take engineering off the charts here. Just go look at our dyno absorbers. The only time we break a dyno absorber shaft, which we've done, I don't know, 8 or 10 of them here, is low RPM, high torque, when the torque comes in really hard. So like basically if you're lugging a turbo motor real low on the RPM, and all of a sudden you get to that where the boost comes in really hard, there's a term for it, but we don't want to get too crazy. Right there, when that torque comes in, it does some serious load, on the parts. Let's just call it damage.
You don't want to call it damage.
It's cost me a lot of money, but we learn a lot. So hopefully we get better with it, right? But yeah, the low RPM. So it's kind of a catch-22. The supercharger is abrupt. The turbocharger comes in and puts the torque in harder than the supercharger, right? At that point of where it transitions. And a normally aspirated one is probably the nicest because it's smoother, even though it could be a 900 cubic inch engine with all kinds of torque. It's just a real smooth transitioning thing. But when you think about that, that's like driving next to something with grandma driving versus something really gnarly. You know what I mean? Because you might have 1,000 horsepower naturally aspirated boat exactly the same as what you're driving next to you. The supercharged one almost always is going to out-accelerate it even with the same power. But at the top end, they'll be next to each other, say, right?
Yeah.
So it's how the power comes in, which is, again, we could talk for hours about compounding, but, my net power might be the same as a turbo motor sitting next to me, right? But the ability to accelerate at different rates and change the torque around is kind of neat,
Yeah. Yeah. And I kind of want to explain to the listener, too, what Alexi is saying, like, this is years and years and years of experience. So, and I'm not going to say, you're right in everything. Obviously, you've learned along the way. You've made mistakes to where you're kind of like, oh, shit, that wasn't right,
What made us successful in this business is making mistakes and damaging things internally before we release it to a customer.
Yeah.
So we learn from damaging things every day still till today.
So moving on to the next question, and I'm going to go off of this one. Justin, thanks for tuning back in on this one. So this is one of your questions from last week was, and this is actually what we're going to be talking about for a good chunk of this show, is how do you size blowers and or turbos And then like the end part of that question is per cubic inches. So tonight me and Alexi talked a little bit beforehand, and we've kind of gone over what a turbo does and what a supercharger does, and now we're going to talk about turbo size, single versus twin, and then we're going to pick up back on the compound where we got cut off last week. So.
Right, so sizing a turbo or supercharger is really important to know what it is that you're building, right? So if you have a small cubic inch engine, you can do some math and figure out what the maximum amount of airflow the engine can take, assuming the efficiency is X, whatever it is, 100%, 80%, whatever the VE is, right? Volumetric efficiency. So once you know all that, you can kind of back into it and look at charts for turbos that have ARs and different flow characteristics and wheels and compressor housings, and they have all kinds of terms, different manufacturers. But basically, like, here's a small turbo, right? And then they have different sizes internally here and on the exit, right? So you can decide, and you can combo things really neat. So like this is the exhaust side, right? So this is a really small exhaust side of a turbo, which is basically a turbine housing. And this is the compressor housing. This is what pushes fresh air pressurized into the intake manifold. And what's really cool is if your engine builder or yourself does a little research, you can kind of figure out what the maximum amount of air is based on how much boost you want to run. And you can customize this. You can run a small turbine housing to spool the turbo really quick, because this side doesn't really care or know what's going on this side, right? So, and then think of it as propellers. You can have a big propeller in a small housing, or a small propeller in the, or mix it up. So there is a lot to know, but basically how much power, net power, are you trying to make is really the question. So when we look at turbocharging or supercharging, we just want to know what's the net power that you're trying to make. And then how is it going to be used? If it's going to be used continuous duty for 100 miles at 80 to 100% power, then you want to run a bigger compressor and a bigger intercooler. And even if it's unnecessary, that way the air inlet temperature going into the engine is not killing the engine and overheating parts. Because once you have a hot air inlet temperature, the engine will start detonating. Or if the engine is running hot or creeping into a hot, range, you could have the pistons start scuffing and make it look like it's lean, or you can have all kinds of detonation going on because it's, the engine just can't run, if it's detonating. So if you want to stay, like your need might be here, but you may choose to go here a little bigger by 20% just to keep yourself in a safe margin. Kind of goes into how hot my engine should run. That's a big topic because it depends on how it's machined and what the use is going to be. So, but that goes on with superchargers too. A lot of guys will say, okay, well, I have a 540 and I want to produce 800 horsepower. Well, there's a little engine behind me, right? It's got a 1271 blower, which is an oddball, right? So, but some guys will say, well, I want to run a 14, but they don't understand that extra couple inches in the back is not really relative for that engine. So again, you have to know how much air in liters can this supercharger or that one or any of them move. So basically it's a compressor, right? So how much can your engine receive? And that a lot of that has to do with the heads and the camshaft profiles, because if those things, you could have the best engine in the world, but the camshaft and the heads will determine how efficient it is. So if it's not perfectly efficient or not optimal for a turbo versus a supercharger cam, that's a whole other topic, it may or may not run that great. But the average guy might say, hey, my boat runs good. And I can look at it and go, well, it can run a hell of a lot better if you had this, this, and this. You know what I mean? But the average person doesn't know. It just runs good and it goes 80 or whatever it is.
So what would you say?
There's a lot to do.
Yeah, and obviously we talked about this beforehand too, that we weren't going to get in too much into sizing because it really is a mathematical equation. It's
sure, and we're just going to touch around the edge there.
Yeah, and so you kind of touched actually a question that I had written down was you talked about well, if this and this and this is done in the bottom of the motor, or the top and bottom of the motor, the turbo will work that much better. So I guess, the next question could be, what's a safe amount of boost that someone could run with a stock motor?
So that's a loaded question, but let's touch it. Let's touch it. No, it's a popular question. So let's just assume the stock engine was unbreakable parts wise. Okay, that's what let's just assume that. So if you have just a regular 454, but it had like billet crank and billet rods and just stock compression. So what's critical is to know what the static compression ratio of the engine is, which is the basic compression of the engine in its regular state without any boost going into it. The other thing is, if you guys want to look online or play with it, there's a chart called final compression ratio, which is the net amount of compression ratio after the boost is added to the static compression. The combination of the two is your net final compression. And there's ranges, like 15.7, 16 might be like push and pump gas, and then some guys get away with 17 to 1 in their final compression numbers on 89 octane. It depends on the cam, the intercooler, what the engine temperature is, and how the engine was set up clearance-wise. And the cam profile, obviously, is a big deal. So, having that information and knowing that is critical, right? But, usually if your compression, let's just do what's typical in the answer here. An 8.75 to 1 stock 502 is usually good for 6 to 7 pounds of boost, which is on the high side and pushing that 15.7 final compression ratio for 91 octane. But a lot of guys fail with it because they're 91 in January at the beginning of the season that's been sitting in their boat for a year is not 91 anymore. So they have a problem and they say, oh man, it was too high. I was running too much boost. And it also depends on how much timing they're putting in the motor, right? You put 35 degrees in a stock motor, it's going to blow up. So, and again, that's determined on the cam and everything. But, most stock motors, 5 pounds is a good number to kind of stick with. Usually most of them under 9 to 1 will take 5 pounds without any, too much headache. But, it's risky when you go above the final compression numbers that are allowable for pump gas. And I encourage you guys to Google that. BDS has a good chart. Good Vibrations has a good chart online, and a few other companies, random ones. It's a mathematical formula, but they have it all sorted out on a chart. You can kind of look at pulleys and the difference in sizes and how that matters. But what's interesting about that, Jake, is a lot of these places have these pulley charts, right? Well, they tell you like, oh, it's 2 more pounds if you go down 2 teeth. Well, how the heck do they know what's in the motor to tell you that? And how do they know which blower you're referring to? Is it a 671 or a 14 or a Whipple? Like, you can't just go off a chart. It's just giving you an idea. I just find it humorous because guys say, well, I went off the chart and it only went up 1.5 pounds and it said it would go up 4. I'm like, so you're online again. You can just, it's literally like textbook.
And obviously, kind of what you're talking about is, kind of a perfect world. You have this healthy motor with billet parts, so in that perfect world with a healthy motor with billet parts, what is the reliability factor for like a motor running 5 psi? I mean, will it go forever, or you still have a lot to worry about?
No, if it's right, 5 psi will run a long time, and it really won't reduce the reliability of the motor. Other than the fact is that you're producing more horsepower in general. Okay?
Yeah, yeah.
But what I'm saying is it really depends on 5 pounds from what. If it's a Whipple 4-liter blower and you run 5 pounds, thing will run forever because they don't draw much torque against the crankshaft. But if you have a stock crankshaft with one little keyway in it and you're trying to run one of these big 6 or 8 or 1071s, you might break your snout right off because there's 250 horsepower just driving the blower off of that keyway. So you kind of got to know, again, what you're doing. You know what I mean? So, but 5 pounds is usually running 1-to-1 on a blower, and that's the ratio between the top and bottom. And they're just kind of chugging along. They're not putting such a gnarly load on the crank and the engine in general.
So I want to, while we're talking about blowers, I mean, how big is too big? Like, at what point with a blower do you get overkill?
So a lot of guys will run, like, we see this a lot actually. Well, guys will say, "Oh, my motor's 1,000 horsepower." We'll say, "Why?" And they'll say, "Well, I have a 1471 blower." And again, they don't understand even what that means half the time. I mean, it's longer, right? But they don't realize that if you have two little carburetors up here that are this narrow, none of that efficiency is going to get out around the backside of that blower, back in and down through that intercooler, and actually into the manifold in any kind of an efficient manner. But it does have the ability to move more air. So, what I'm saying is a bit contradictory, right? But it's something that is pretty interesting. Like, the bigger blowers will move more air at a cooler temperature, right? Because they're not having to spin as many RPM to get the same net volume into the motor. So if you do that, in any case, your air inlet temperatures are going to go down, which allows more molecules to get into the cylinder, so to speak. And the more you can do that with denser, cooler inlet temperatures, the better power you're going to make more reliably, which is why we intercool and do different things like that, intercool. And a lot of times we see these giant blowers with tiny carburetors, and we're like, why? It doesn't make any sense. You have a big giant blower that can't draw through the carburetor, but it runs, and the guy's happy with
it. Well, and this is something we touched on last 2 weeks ago show too. Is a bigger blower puts more load on the crank too, so you're actually robbing power to get more power.
Right, so there is a point of diminishing returns on a lot of supercharger products that are non-screw. What I mean by that in basic terms is you'll get to the point where you might have a 632 cubic inch big motor you put together with giant heads and maybe a clone of what we use or other manufacturers on a cam profile, and you'll put a blower on there and you'll run 12 pounds of boost, but when you try to go to 15, the boat will slow down or the engine will make less power in your hot rod or sand car. Well, that's because you're now, if you look at it on a strain gauge chart or some kind of dynamometer information, you see that now you're having to make 500 horsepower to get 550 horsepower net power to the motor, or you're having to make 550 horsepower through the blower and you're really only putting out 400 extra. So you're actually going backwards and running the blower harder, and you're increasing the temperature and coming out of the blower, which puts you in a bad position with detonation.
Yeah, and that was something too in the show we did before. Like, I never really thought about that. Like, too big, you're actually starting to get to that point where you're not helping yourself at all. So that was kind of a cool thing for the listener. Going to make you go back to the last one because we talked about that a little more. But that was something I didn't really understand, and I think the average person sometimes might not understand. They just come in and they say, "Hey, Alexi, this shit looks really cool. I want the big one."
And that happens, and we explain it to them. It might not be the best choice. Actually, a bigger blower will have worse torque at the bottom because it's just a bigger blower. Sometimes a little blower compresses the air faster. So a lot of times an 871 on a 540 cubic inch engine might be the best choice, right? Depending on the cam and the exhaust. Like, we've outperformed 1471s with smaller blowers at 1,000 horsepower because we're matching all that exactly mathematically and historically to what we found is the best kind of combination, right? And it's sometimes against the rules, or the rumors. There's both. There's rules and rumors. So you're kind of cutting out, just so you know.
Yeah, I can see I'm a little delayed. I'm not sure why. Can you still hear me, though?
Yes.
So it looks okay on Facebook. We're cutting out a little bit. So the next thing is I want to talk singles versus twins. Obviously, everyone says, I think this is what I opened with last show was, everyone's like, oh, twin turbo. And you kind of explained right away, like, you can get the same amount of power with a single turbo.
You can get more power out of a single turbo if it's set up right.
Yeah.
So a lot of times, let's just say twin turbos came out because a lot of big turbos weren't available. So you had to put two Like this turbo is good for a 350 small block engine for one. But when you have a 540 or a 632 or a 572 engine, math will tell you that you need double the amount of air, right, to get the power. So we don't have a turbo this big back in the 60s, right? I mean, we did. They were on diesels, but they weren't really fitting on anything in a boat. So they decided to use two Ray J E10 type turbos, which is what Banks used. Race Arrow, the Dunsmore family did all that, and a lot of other Gentry. They were all smaller turbos, but they had better fitment. And because they had better fitment, that's how it evolved on the marine side of things and really in the cars. So that has a lot to do with it. But if you plumb two exhaust pipes into one giant, they have huge turbos. I mean, they have 100 millimeters. There's one behind me. They're giant turbos out there. You can definitely make the power because remember, it's just how much air can possibly go through this. So if this is 60 millimeters, right, you're going to get X amount of power, right? Or if you have one this size, this is almost 100 millimeters. Okay? So, I mean, that's a big turbo right there, right? So one of those will do almost what two of these will do. And this isn't a small guy. This is just an average size.
Yeah.
They're smaller. So, I mean, 100 millimeter turbo makes some big power, and we use two of them now. 200 millimeter turbos or 90s or even 80s. Like an 88 millimeter turbo, two of them, they'll go 2,000, 2,200 all day long. If the bottom end of the motor obviously can handle it.
Yeah.
So, but, and it's based on how much volume of air can fit through that hole based on what it has for twist. I'm using basic terms on the impeller wheels. You know what I mean? The amount of curve that's in them and how efficient it can draw the air in.
What is the weight difference? Because so before we started this, Alexi was saying that one was really heavy. What's the weight difference in those two turbos?
So this is the aluminum compressor side. It's usually aluminum, and it's really light, right? I can bounce it around. But like these little guys on the exhaust side, it has to put up with a lot more heat, right?
Yeah.
So these are usually steel, Inconel, titanium, cast iron. Just depends on the brand. But like this is probably 5.5 times heavier. So this piece right here, I would say is probably, I don't know, 15 pounds. And the one down there is probably 40. It's heavy. I mean, it's really heavy. I didn't get these from just standing around. I don't go to the gym. I lift cylinder heads. Turbos. The big joke around here. So, but yeah, there's a weight difference for sure, but it's because of what they go through environmentally.
Yeah.
So, basically you're putting a fan in your exhaust, so it's got to put up with 1,500 degrees all day long.
Yeah.
That's a question that came up in our Boostpower TV, by the way, is, like we were explaining on when you and I were doing the show, we were explaining that, one side is the exhaust, then there's a little cartridge and a shaft in here, and then it draws fresh air in. They're saying, how does that 1,500 degree temperature right next to it not transfer into the turbo? That's a good question because it's insulated with a bearing, but because the thing's spinning so fast and there's so much fresh air drawing in, it's hardly relevant, which is kind of an amazing thing.
Well, and I kind of had a similar question today when I was thinking about topics for this show is, how much does an intercooler really cool down, that air going back to the motor? How big of a difference is an intercooler? Are we talking thousands? Are we talking hundreds? Or,
No. So we do this test every time we dyno. We have a pre and aft probe inside the intake of the blower and underneath the intercooler. And normally one of these big, what we call less efficient type superchargers that's, just kind of a older design, they'll make at wide open throttle for a long period of time, they'll get up to 170, 180 before an intercooler, which is really high. It's actually pretty high, but you got to think about it. it's not that high. You're already in 129-degree weather before you get under your hatch in your boat.
Yeah.
So if you're really only going plus 50 degrees, it's really not that bad, right? But down below where your pistons live, they're pissed off at you for bringing that kind of heat in the motor. They don't like it at all. So what happens is when the computers start seeing that, they say, whoa, whoa, retard the timing. What's going on? Add fuel, do something. It's crazy down here. So, you gotta understand that usually the typical 4-inch intercooler, depending on the brand, of course, it matters if it's an aluminum radiator versus a Cooper-nickel versus there's all kinds of, there's brass ones, there's just copper. Just depends on the brand and what you're using. But we usually will see a 60 to 70 degree drop in the inlet temperature. But interestingly enough, when you do this test while the boat is in the water rather than cheating on a dyno and running it consistently with water,
Yeah.
a lot of intercoolers are plumbed in a manner to where when you're on plane and running the boat, the water is force fed into it. So nothing is going through it until you're on plane and going maybe 5 miles, 10 miles an hour, or even on some boats, 20. So it's interesting because if you floor that boat on the dyno with no intercooler, with the timing high and no water going through it, it's knocking. But if you turn the water on and cool the core and then floor it, it doesn't. So a lot of guys fail at this. They test the motor on their dyno, assuming that the boat's going to have the intercooler water at idle, and it doesn't. So no one knows this. It's like you go to take off and you get knock, 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 knock. You don't hear it. It's happening. And all of a sudden you're going down the lake and, oh, my crank broke, or I broke a rod and I just don't know what happened. And if you look at the data log, every time the guy goes from 0 to 2,500, it's knocking. It's tattletaling on them, right? We print it out and show it to them. Here it is. This is what's going on, and this is why. You know what I mean? So there's a lot of stuff going on with that. You got to be real careful because sometimes there's this rumor, oh, your engine won't idle if you run water through the intercooler all the time. If it's set up right, it'll be just fine because it's going to be fairly consistent with what's going on. You know how hot these superchargers get just idling? They're not moving any air through them at idle, right?
Yeah.
They're just literally barely moving air through it. When you open the throttle blades of a carburetor or fuel injection, you're cooling off the blower, and that's why you start to see ice underneath the carburetors or throttle bodies, because you're doing a pressure change and it's running a volume of air through the rotors, and now it's cool. But think about it. When you're idling out of the marina, that blower is hotter than hell, right? When you open the throttle blades right away, that hot air is still in there. That first spike of air going into the motor is doing damage. And you can't hear it with your ear.
Yeah. So would you say a marine motor, a marine turbo motor, or intercooled motor, I guess anything, does it have an advantage because it constantly has that water flow?
Yeah, all engines have what I call a clear advantage if they're intercooled on gasoline because of the fact that you can keep it at a cooler temperature no matter what. Now, remember, it's interesting at idle versus 2,500 RPM versus 6,000 RPM. You got to remember, it's a heat exchanger, and it depends on how much volume of boost you're putting through the intercooler as to how good it can pull heat out. So at wide open 6,000 RPM, you better have a lot of water going through that core, but it passes through it so fast that sometimes we'll test the motor and shut the intercooler off and it's hardly relevant because even though it's getting 50-degree water going through it, it's not keeping the charge. There's no way for the heat to exchange because it's going by it so fast.
Yeah.
That's why those tall intercoolers you see on the old Gentry type fuel injection systems or ones that are, really big, right? They have a huge advantage because that little bit of milliseconds of time that charge is going through the core is a huge advantage of how much heat it can pull out. And nobody even thinks about it. They just use this little 4-inch super chiller or Lee cooler or whatever brand they buy. They're all good, But if you're running big power, big volume, and holding an engine wide open throttle for a long period of time, you will see what I'm talking about if you do the data.
So what you're saying is some things should be big, some things should be normal sized, some things should be small.
Yeah, it's pretty much what I always say. Sit down with a customer, a person, and plot it out like you're building a house or building anything. How are you going to use it? What do you want out of it? Do you want pump gas, race gas? This question comes up in our shop all the time. Hey, this guy in Florida, he wants a pump gas 1,000 horse. Okay, good. So we build it a certain way because they have 93 octane,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where if a guy down the street calls, we have 15% ethanol and we only have 91 octane. It's a different part number. It's a different animal. That little bit of octane and the big amount of ethanol makes a huge difference, especially with vapor lock.
Well, I think that's definitely. I think the fuel types and stuff. I think that should be our part 3 because I think there's
Sure.
a lot of
Sure.
things we could go off on the fuel types and running different types of fuel, and that's kind
Right. I mean,
of something we talked about in the beginning too. Was running alcohol versus running
right.
race
Yeah, we
gas.
touched on that a little bit. Yeah, when you run alcohol, it's like a free intercooler.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're
Yeah,
about
people used to ask us when we first built our 800 cubic inch engines, they're like, that was dumb. You didn't put an intercooler on it. And I'm like, really? Let me know when you run alcohol in your motor and tell me how the inlet temperatures are. Meanwhile, we're making 2,200 horsepower and holding it. So, I mean, we're not geniuses. We just test things and do research and have a little education.
yeah.
So you just kind of got to check it out. It's nothing new. I mean, look at a sprint car. They run alcohol and they have no cooling system. I mean, they have hardly anything, right?
Yeah.
That's because they're running a free intercooler.
Yeah. Well, we're about 42 minutes. Is there anything else you kind of want to talk about before we? There's not a ton of listener questions.
Yeah, usually we get them after.
Yeah. So for those that have joined and have asked questions, I don't think I'm seeing all the questions either. For some reason, Facebook didn't update this week, and a lot of them aren't showing up. So if you do have questions, ask in these, and we'll either answer them through Facebook or we'll come back and answer them on the next show, kind of starting off the same way. So
Sounds good. I mean, what we could talk about is what people want to hear about what we've said in the first 2 shows, or even if you just listen to this one. Let us know in the comments, and Jake will go over them, and we can maybe have some more display items to show you and different things. Wastegates is a big one, Jake. I mean, a lot of guys ask how wastegates work, and now that they're electronic versus mechanical versus, can they cause damage? That's a big deal right there. Some wastegates, they rust shut, stop working, and overboost the engine, and if it's carbureted, there's nothing to help it, and it goes boom.
So I mean, I think that's a whole nother topic too we could get on is wastegates.
Right.
I think we touched a little bit on wastegates a little bit in the first show.
Yeah.
And so, but I think that's let's end with this one. This is a good question. E85. It's a very big fuel source in the off-road world or in the recreational off-road world. What's the application of E85 for boats?
Well, a lot of people run E85 thinking they're going to get more power, and usually E85, because it's, let's just call it anywhere from 80 to 98% alcohol, right? Because depends if you buy it at the pump versus like Ignite or other brands, VP. They all have their own version of this fuel. So, and they'll test differently. But in general, you're running alcohol or some sort of alcohol. So you're going to make more power, but you have to have a carburetor or a fuel injection set up to accommodate the 40% change of fuel, right? So the disadvantage is it attracts water.
Yeah.
So in a boat, it's a horrible thing for most use because it'll pull water, and when you take the fuel filter off and pour it in a jar, you'll see that there's this much water in the bottom of the fuel. So, when we run it in some of our customers' boats, when we're done, we flip a switch and we put fuel back through the motor, and then it avoids any of that. But if you leave it stored in the fuel tank of a boat and you leave it overnight where it's dewy, like down at the ocean or even Lake Havasu at night or Florida, South Florida, you might get humidity. It'll pull water in, and you constantly have to remove water. It's like you need a sensor. We actually use a sensor from a Duramax, which is a water sensor in the filter on the diesel trucks that indicate a light. So these guys know, hey, I'm running E85. This thing's got water in the filter, so don't run it hard until you drain it. And
Yeah.
it may only be in the filter, but you got to assume it's in the tank. So, um, it's amazing how water works its way into fuel around a boat. I mean, it's on the water, right?
Yeah, and I think water can hurt a lot of things. Obviously,
Well,
water.
water gets in the condensation gets in the valve covers. We get this call all the time. I started my motor for the first time in a while, and it's smoking out of the breathers a little bit, but it dissipates and goes away. Is something wrong with my motor? And I'm like, let it run for 15 minutes. And what's happening is it's burning the moisture off that was drawn in over the winter or wherever it is in the valve cover. It depends how it's ventilated. Usually they call back and they're like, yeah, it's all good, you know. But people worry because they think maybe a ring is bad and it's just bellowing out oil or whatever. But
Yeah.
or they'll take their valve cover cap off and be like, oh, it's milky. Well, that's because all the moisture is in the top end of the motor because that's where the vents are.
Yeah.
So sometimes that happens,
Definitely.
So, but yeah, we'll go over any questions anybody has.
Yeah, we'll go over those. If you do have any, ask them still as you're rewatching this or replaying it. When is the next? When are we going to see you doing Boostpower talk next?
Probably the next couple of weeks we'll roll it out again. We had about a handful of people that said, wow, I noticed it was on YouTube and I really wanted to catch up to them. And idiot me watched 5 videos tonight. And I'm like, well, if you like them, watch them all and then we'll catch up. So we did this last year where we took like 2 or 3 weeks off and instead did like our quick tips, which is like a short segment on, like how to do something with this or that. So we've been doing those in between, but probably after next week we'll do another series. And then usually we take July off because of 4th of July, and I'm usually out of overseas. So I'm not back till the end of the July, but sometimes we'll replay them then, and then we usually stay consistent after that through all the way through the end of the year.
Well, I appreciate you coming on and talking some tech stuff with for the Boats and Shows podcast and working with me on this. Something that I know that I don't have a ton of experience with, and I think the listener always gets a solid advantage, having you on the show to talk some technical stuff.
I always tell people, I try to keep it simple so people understand. There's listeners that understand it as good or better than me, maybe, and there's people that don't understand it at all. We try to kind of get in the middle so everybody can kind of enjoy what they're doing. And, even if you don't maybe like the topic, you're going to learn something. And if you don't, that's too bad, but we want you to.
Yeah. So if you liked this, the Boost talk that we did, comment, let us know you liked it. So with that, I don't have anything else. Let's end this thing.
All right. See you guys next time.
See you next time.